For quite some time now, space enthusiasts around the world have been glued to events like this. The Starship prototypes, one after another, going through their process of eventually making orbit. Indeed, even as I'm recording this, thousands upon thousands of people are watching SN8 rolling out to the launch pad. And why shouldn't they be excited? This is going to be a tremendous breakthrough, the biggest in human history, arguably, when it comes to getting mankind to other worlds. It's just an amazing time to be a space enthusiast. But over the last few days, I've been watching videos like this, obviously about Rocket Lab and their Electron rocket, their flagship that stands a mere 17 meters tall. A private space company that, although it moved its headquarters to the United States for economic reasons a few years ago, started and essentially is the pride of a country that has less than 5 million people. And yet, in spite of its modest beginnings, in spite of the fact that the Electron rocket carries payloads that are measured in kilograms and not in metric tons, this company is just as innovative and just as exciting as SpaceX, just for different reasons. It's much, much more than just a company that's launching small sats to low Earth orbit. This is a company that, like SpaceX, has ambitions that would have seemed completely impossible just a few years ago. They're going to the moon next year, and far further than that if they're successful, because, as I think a lot of you probably know from a recent announcement, they're headed for another destination that's interplanetary, and they're not going to Mars, but they're going someplace else, and if they are successful, they'll be the first organization in human history to discover extraterrestrial life, which would be quite amazing. And as most of you know, this is their destination. And I'm going to tell you how they're going to accomplish this amazing goal in just a few moments. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. This is a show or a channel where I routinely get pissed off about things, and in this case, I'm really pissed off. But for a change, I'm pissed off at myself. I've known about Rocket Lab for a very long period of time, and yet I have not done a single show about them aside from one live stream where I discuss companies like them, and that's pretty much it. I have regarded companies like Rocket Lab as very good companies, companies that are good at what they do, but restricted essentially to sending small sats into low Earth orbit, which is their niche and where they make their money, and that's pretty much it. In terms of contributing to man's exploration of the solar system, just wasn't really in their wheelhouse, and so therefore they weren't particularly interesting to me. And man, was I wrong. So horribly wrong. Rocket Lab has huge ambitions. They're far more similar to SpaceX than I ever gave them credit for. And really, I think more than a lot of other folks give them credit for as well. This is a company that can launch a payload into orbit for $6 million, as opposed to the Falcon 9, which does it for about 50. Now, granted, It's a lot smaller payload, and the Falcon 9 could theoretically carry something out like that with ride shares and things, but still, you can't take away the fact that this company can put a payload into orbit for less than anybody else. And now they're going a lot further than that. They're going to the moon next year. And as many of you have probably heard, they're also going to Venus. Now, first of all, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. This company is a New Zealand company. I don't care if Wikipedia has them listed as an American company with a wholly owned subsidiary in New Zealand. That's purely for economic reasons. This company started in New Zealand, was driven by talent from New Zealand, and should always be considered a product of this country. And this is their CEO and founder. Peter Beck is an engineer and a self-made success story who's been awarded the Meritorious Medal from the Royal Aeronautical Society in New Zealand and also the Royal Society's Cooper Medal. See what I mean about the New Zealand part? Now, this guy is every bit as driven as Elon Musk, as his business strategy easily suggests. For example, on July 4th, not that long ago, there is a highly publicized failure of an Electron rocket to reach orbit, and they lost 7 satellites in the process. This failure was a significant blow to the company, and it generated words of sympathy from Elon Musk and SpaceX. And on top of that, even these guys expressed words of sympathy. And Virgin Orbit, who hasn't even launched anything into orbit at this point, but these guys were very silent, and I think for good reason. And look, I'm not slamming on Blue Origin just for the fun of it. The fact of the matter is that Rocket Lab, as a company that's worth less than $2 billion, has managed to carry out more than a dozen orbital launches, whereas Blue Origin, in 20 years, has yet to get a single thing into orbit. And okay, maybe the fact that these guys ran me off their property with a security guard might have something to do with my opinions, but if somebody can find a quote from Jeff Bezos about the July 4th Rocket Lab failure, then I'll be happy to publicly apologize in the next episode, because I was unable to find anything. But my point to all of this is right after Rocket Lab determined that a faulty electrical connector in the second stage had caused the failure of the launch, at the end of August they were right back at it with another launch. No extensive delays, no extensive investigations, no fretting over whether or not their future customers might be affected as well. They just went right back to launching in spite of the failure, which is something that SpaceX is famous for. So let's get back to an Electron launch in detail. First of all, this rocket, as I've said before, is tiny, and that's pretty important because it's powered by 9 Rutherford engines with only 51,000 pounds worth of thrust at sea level. The engines are powered by liquid oxygen and something called RP1, which is refined petroleum 1, or a very stable and highly refined form of kerosene. The second stage has 1 Rutherford engine with 5,800 pounds of thrust in a vacuum, and you can add a kick stage if you wish to gain further orbital altitude, or there are other modifications that you can make to this rocket, which we'll talk about in a moment. All of this allows the Electron to get 300 kilograms to low Earth orbit and 200 kilograms to what's called Sun-synchronous orbit. So how the hell do they get anything into orbit with so little thrust? Well, it's all about the efficient mass production of carbon fiber, something that's been looked upon as a bad thing by SpaceX fans just because of the Starship, but for these little rockets, it's proven to be very effective simply because carbon fiber is so light and so strong. And because it's so light, especially the first stage, this has led Rocket Lab to embrace the concept of reusability, even though at first they said that they weren't going to do something along these lines, but they've changed their minds. As you can see, they're using a helicopter much like ULA, but the difference is they're going to try to recover the entire first stage and not just the engines like ULA. And also another difference is they've already tested this, whereas ULA is still a few years away from doing it. Once again, quick development, much like SpaceX. In any event, the rocket hits the atmosphere at about 7,000 kilometers per hour and drops down to about 900 before the recovery attempt begins. Once the speed is dropped sufficiently, then chutes are deployed, which is only possible again because the stage is so light. And this would be suicidal for just about any other type of rocket stage. And then the helicopter recovers the stage, and by the way, this process has already been successfully tested and is probably going to come into general use next year. But the secret launch of the Photon satellite, or a better term would probably be spacecraft, was a game changer for Rocket Lab, and it's going to allow them to do so much more. A lot of the details about this spacecraft are still secret. However, it is going to allow NASA to carry out a CubeSat mission to the moon in early 2021. The mission is called the CIS Lunar Autonomous Positioning System Technology Operations and Navigation Experiment, or CAPSTONE, thank God for short. Anyway, I am a huge fan of this mission because it's a precursor to the Lunar Gateway. Let me explain why. The mission will mirror the Gateway's rectilinear halo orbit, performing a variety of maneuvers in that orbit and also entering that orbit in the first place, which no spacecraft has ever done, demonstrating the viability of NASA's plan. This is an excellent idea to make certain that the Gateway is going to be a viable solution in this particular orbit, and that it will be able to support astronauts on the surface of the moon from this configuration. And by the way, this launch contract is being carried out for $9.95 million, not billion, million, which is an absolute bargain by NASA standards. So Rocket Lab is carrying out an invaluable first step in the whole Artemis project for the same cost as one of the rivets on the SLS. Okay, maybe that's an exaggeration, but not much of one. But even more exciting than this is Rocket Lab's plans, as many of us know, to go all the way to Venus using the same ship, because the delta V required to get to Venus is about the same as it requires to get to the moon. Of course, it takes longer, but still, it's just as doable. Peter Beck has long believed in the possibility of life in the Venusian atmosphere, and this is based on information that we've had for a while, and I've talked about it in previous episodes, so instead of just rehashing that, let's go back to one of those episodes for a few moments. Back to Venus and its strange atmosphere. The strange dark streaks that we are so accustomed to seeing are made up of what's called unknown absorbers, something that apparently reflects and absorbs ultraviolet radiation, affecting the albedo or the brightness of the planet. It also affects the planet's climate, much as bacteria and microbial life does on Earth. On top of that, examinations, spectrographic examinations that is, of these unknown absorbers show that they're physically and chemically similar to various types of bacteria here on Earth, strongly suggesting that there is something alive in the Venusian atmosphere, although it's probably something radically different from anything we have here on Earth. What a discovery that would be. So I wanted to show you that clip just to give you an idea of how long we really have suspected the existence of life in the Venusian atmosphere. It's not just a recent thing. In addition to that, I also wanted to emphasize the fact that I seem to have had more of a mellow voice back then, and boy, does a pop filter make a big difference. But other than that, Rocket Lab is going to be able to carry out this mission by 2023 if their plans go well. They potentially will have the ability to discover extraterrestrial life before anybody else does. A tiny little company like this will be able to discover extraterrestrial life before SpaceX, before NASA, before anybody. And this makes Rocket Lab a power player in the private space community. But Venus is not the only target. There's a company called Sat Revolution in Poland who are actually teaming up with Virgin Orbital, who sadly have not been able to get anything to orbit yet, but the mission is very similar to something that Rocket Lab would do, and that is to send a smallsat mission to Mars. The focus of this particular mission is what a lot of orbital missions to Mars have wanted to accomplish, that is, studying the atmosphere and things, but with a special focus on Phobos. And as I've mentioned in previous episodes, Phobos could be an excellent base camp to explore the red planet, especially if it's a source of rocket fuel, and this particular mission might determine quite a bit about that. So the Electron rocket and the little Photon spaceship has the ability to carry out reconnaissance for SpaceX, gathering information about Mars before the Starship is actually sent there, just as they're gathering information for NASA before the Lunar Gateway is deployed. The potential for collaborations between Rocket Lab and SpaceX are endless. And one other thing to keep in mind, the dry mass of an Electron rocket is only 12.5 tons, meaning that the components of an Electron rocket could easily be carried inside a Starship's fairings. As a matter of fact, perhaps 7 or 8 of them. Could Electron rockets be useful on Mars? Obviously, there'd be a lot of complications to this, but given that Mars has only 1/3 the gravity of Earth, who knows what kind of payload an Electron might be able to carry and the usefulness it could serve to a Martian colony. So, obviously, a lot of what I've talked about in this episode is purely speculative. Rocket Lab has not expressed any desires to go to Mars anytime in the future, although they have mentioned it as a possibility. They don't have any specific missions. And the things that I've talked about that they might be able to accomplish on Mars or with Phobos, those sorts of things, all of this is speculative. But nevertheless, when we're talking about exploring the solar system, we also need to be talking about as many companies as possible and as many institutions as possible contributing to the overall success of our endeavor to make our species into a multiplanetary civilization. And I believe very strongly that Rocket Lab can play a small part and an ever increasing part in this goal, regardless of whether our colony may be on Venus or Mars or any place else. Obviously, their ambitions are not just in low Earth orbit, but rather interplanetary. And who knows what's coming up next? And I think that that organizations like NASA, the ESA, and others, plus SpaceX for that matter, need to be seriously looking at these folks and their capabilities and what they may be able to accomplish to achieve what we have hoped for so long, to get mankind to another world. So, that having been said, once again, the dreaded coffee cup is still here. I'm over 22,000 subscribers and still climbing. Thank you very much. But I want to blow this thing up and I want to blow it up soon. So if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so because it's going to be very entertaining. Also, A lot of folks have done things about Rocket Lab, but not everybody speculates the way I do and talks about possibilities and outside the box the way I do, as you folks have probably figured out by now. So if you want to continue seeing content like this, go to the description. There are many ways to support me. And any way that you could possibly support me would be greatly appreciated, because this has been my career for the last couple of months, and I want this to keep going for the rest of my life until I'm no longer at least able to talk. So, that having been said, until we are ready to embrace every company, every possibility that may help us to go to other planets and reach out towards man's destiny, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.